On May 12, 1957, a group of locals from Guidizzolo, Italy gathered in front of their homes to watch some of the world's finest sports cars flash by en route to the finish line that would mark the end of the grueling Mille Miglia. For 30 years, other locals in previous generations had stood alongside that very same ribbon of road, watching that very same race. But on May 12th, a Ferrari 335S scythed through the crowd, and in an instant, 9 spectators were dead, cut down just outside of their homes. This was the crash that would kill the Mille Miglia, Italy's iconic 1,000-mile race from Brescia to Rome. Ask around, though, and you might find that the tragedy of civilian deaths was nothing compared to the horror of that Ferrari driver's, Spanish nobleman Alfonso de Portago. If you watch the 2023 film starring Adam Driver as Enzo Ferrari, then you're likely familiar with this incident. The crash at the end of the movie is the very one that ended the Mille Miglia. Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're going to turn our gaze to the driver in question, Alfonso de Portago, in order to better understand how some motorsport accidents are deemed more tragic than others, thanks to the mythic status drivers like de Portago held. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Long before there was a single permanent circuit to be found in Europe, motorsport events consisted of driving from one city to the next as quickly as possible over open public roads. The first such event took place in 1894, when some of the earliest automobiles attempted to travel from Paris to Rouen, a distance of 79 miles that today would be a breeze, but that would have been much more daunting for the drivers of those early cars. Back then, the concept of the automobile sprang to life when some enterprising tinkerers decided to fit a power source, sometimes a combustion engine, an electric motor, or a big belching steam engine, to the carriages that they had laying around in the stables. The result were these bulky, square boxes teetering on large wooden wheels shod in a strip of rubber. The early city-to-city drivers steered with a long, wobbly tiller that could be wrenched from their hands the moment they hit a bump. And yes, bumps were common. Brakes were nothing but a piece of wood that would be jammed down on the tire, and the driver would have to pull on a lever with all of his might to, perhaps, bring the car to a stop. But as primitive as those early machines might sound to us today, they were effectively technological marvels, and when a slew of early French machines took off from Paris in 1894, there was a spark of innovation in the air. Locals gathered along the dusty road from Paris to Rouen, and some of the more skeptical among them raced the puttering cars on horseback, building up a big gap and then turning around to meet the early automobiles before rocketing ahead once again, taunting the drivers all the way. With an average speed of 11.6 miles per hour, it took those early cars 7 hours to reach Rouen, though admittedly most of the machines failed to even get close. Those that made it had spent a long day being jarred to the bone by rutted roads, inhaling endless clouds of white dust, and in some cases, even being attacked by farm dogs that were horrified by all the racket. But when that first car crossed the line in Rouen, the men behind the wheel were heroes, and a new sport was born. It's hard to imagine the kind of breathless reporting that went on in the newspapers after that race, but all of France was enamored by the idea that they could travel from one place to another without needing to saddle up a horse. More city-to-city races began to pop up, linking Paris to Dieppe, then Paris to Bordeaux, and then, in the first example of an international event, Paris to Berlin. Automotive technology was still primitive, but those early races proved that there was plenty of room to experiment with design. Alternative forms of power faded as the internal combustion engine became the preferred power plant, and those engines started to swell in size and power. The teetering, boxy bodies got lower, and the tiller was replaced with a wide steering wheel. By 1898, some of the newest cars were able to travel at almost 30 miles per hour. As speeds increased, so did the danger. First came the death of the Marquis of Montagnac, who lost control of his early automobile in 1898 and was thrown to his death. Then more drivers began to die behind the wheel too. In 1903, so many cars were entering races and so many spectators had begun to crowd the racing surface that death wasn't just inevitable. It was about to descend on motorsport like a plague. It was the 1903 Paris to Madrid race. Of the 224 cars that started the event, half crashed. 8 people were killed, 5 drivers, 3 spectators. An estimated 100 more were seriously injured. In the aftermath, newspapers speculated that open road racing would be banned almost instantly. And then, 3 years later, Sicily introduced the mighty Targa Florio. Germany debuted the Kaiser Prix. France had open road circuits near Le Mans and Dieppe. In 1907, the Isle of Man TT appeared. Even though a handful of closed-course circuits began to pop up around Europe, there was nothing as appealing as the lure of the open road, and that's exactly how we ended up with the iconic Mille Miglia. The Mille Miglia, English for 1,000 miles, entered the racing scene in 1927. A group of noblemen were dismayed that the annual Italian Grand Prix was about to be moved away from their hometown of Brescia to a new circuit known as Monza, and they wanted a way to get their speed fix closer to home. At the helm of this new endeavor were 2 counts, Imo Maggi and Franco Mazzotti, alongside one sports manager named Renzo Castanedo and the renowned motorsport journalist Giovanni Canestrini. Add in a handful of big money backers and a 1,000-mile race course carved from Brescia to Rome, and you had in your hands a recipe for success that attracted some of the biggest names in pre-war motorsport. Those connections were critical in getting the Mille Miglia up and running. If you know anything about Italy, you probably know that the country boasts incredibly diverse traditions, cuisines, and attitudes, and that's because Italy existed as a very loose confederation of various states until they unified in the mid to late 1800s. Even though Brescia and Rome technically existed within the same country, both cities would have clung to their own distinct histories, and the Mille Miglia founders would have needed to secure approval from both cities, plus every single district along the way. And who knew if they would all agree? As it turns out, a little political clout and the promise of a handsome payday can open a whole lot of doors. Add into the mix an intense passion for sport and a national desire to regain one's foothold against the strong automotive manufacturers from other countries, and you've got a pretty compelling argument for why this 1,000-mile race needed to happen. All those districts agreed, and Italy itself provided 25,000 soldiers to marshal the lengthy course. The first race was scheduled for March 26, 1927, and at exactly 8 a.m., an 8-liter Isotta Fraschini driven by co-founder Count Imo Maggi burst from the start line in an explosion of sound. The very first Mille Miglia had begun. 77 cars competed in that first event, which lasted almost 40 hours and was won by Ferdinando Minola and Giuseppe Morandi behind the wheel of an Officine Mécanique 665 Sport. During the pre-war era, cars got much quicker even if they failed to equal that speed with their reliability, and the race grew in popularity. But as World War II approached, it was clear the Mille Miglia's time was limited. In 1938, the last event before the war, a Lancia killed 10 spectators and forced the subsequent event to take place over 8 laps on a 103-mile circuit. It was only after World War II that racing kicked off again in full force, when the event was revived by 3 of its 4 original founders. In 1947, Italy was still struggling to recover, but the government lifted fuel restrictions just so a field of predominantly Italian cars could revitalize the pride of a nation in distress. Grids swelled into the hundreds, with modern purpose-built cars competing against pre-war racers as well as plenty of road machines. And the fact that it took place just before the 24 Hours of Le Mans made it an even more attractive race for foreign automakers who were looking to get into the racing game. Still, as the 1950s continued, it was clear that a motorsport reckoning was going to be needed, and that the Mille Miglia would have to play a role in that. After the 1955 Le Mans tragedy, organizers capped the entry list at the Mille Miglia at 400 cars, and the route had been altered to avoid some of the more dangerous sections up in the mountains. In the cities and towns the Mille Miglia carved through, more attention was paid to keeping spectators away from the racing surface, and as a result of those changes and a frankly miserable day on the weather front, speeds dropped considerably, with a 1956 running of the Mille Miglia taking 90 minutes longer to complete than the race the year before. Despite all of these precautions, there was nothing organizers could do about the rain. And during the event, 6 people were killed, 3 drivers, 3 spectators, with another 14 injured. Contemporary reports largely brushed over those deaths and injuries. The drivers weren't particularly notable, and after all, the weather was poor enough that it would have been a miracle if there hadn't been a few crashes along the way. In fact, one of the most widely distributed stories from the race, at least as far as the specialist motorsport press was concerned, was journalist Dennis Jenkinson's deeply reported and often very funny Motorsport magazine story about joining Sterling Moss for the big race, only for their car to crash in foul weather. The stage, then, was set for 1957, the year that would see the death of the Mille Miglia. His given name was Don Alfonso Antonio Vicente Eduardo Angel Blas Francisco de Borja Cabeza de Vaca y Leighton, 11th Marquess of Portago, Grandee. But if you saw his name on a race entry list, it would simply read Alfonso de Portago. And if you got to know him, you would have called him Fawn. If that lengthy name didn't give it away, Alfonso de Portago was a member of Spanish nobility born to a father who was a great golfer and president of a prominent country club, and a mother who was a nurse in Ireland. He was named after his godfather, King Alfonso XIII, and from the moment he entered the world in a hospital in London, he was given the kind of upbringing that seemed to belong to a much different era. That's perhaps because his family tree was littered with greatness. His grandfather had been mayor of Madrid, and he could trace his lineage all the way back to Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, a Spanish explorer and one of 4 survivors of the 1527 Narvaez expedition. Intended to explore and colonize Florida, hurricanes, illness, starvation, and backlash from local indigenous communities meant that the crew of 600 was whittled down to just 4 men who managed to escape enslavement and voyage to Mexico City. They were the first known Europeans to lay eyes on the Mississippi River, to cross the Gulf of Mexico, and to travel over Texas. Portago's schooling was done in Biarritz, France, and he grew up speaking 4 languages: Italian, French, Spanish, and English, which he was said to have spoken with a distinct British accent. While motorsport fans know Portago for his racing exploits, he was also one of those all-around sportsmen from a bygone age, back when nobility was trained in a variety of different physical activities. He learned how to fly planes, and at age 17 won a $500 bet by proving he could fly a craft below the London Tower Bridge. His love of horse riding quickly became competitive, and thanks to his slight but bordering on just a little too big size, he twice participated in the Grand National Steeplechase at Aintree as a gentleman jockey. He was also a bobsleigh runner, and in 1956 he gathered together some cousins to compete in the Winter Olympic Games, making them the first Spanish bobsleigh team in the history of the sport. He and his family had a few practice runs before buying sleds in Switzerland, then jumped right into competition, where they finished 4th, just 0.16 seconds shy of a medal. But it was Portago's other love, motorsport, that we're going to talk about today. It's not completely clear how Portago fell in love with racing, but some sources say it was the result of a man named Edmund Nelson. As Portago traveled the world, he became a regular feature at the iconic Plaza Hotel in New York City. There, Nelson, a 42-year-old native of South Dakota, an Air Force veteran, and the elevator operator at the plaza, got to know Portago quite well. Many people suggest that it was Nelson who introduced a Spanish nobleman to the wild world of motorsport, and it wasn't long before Nelson and Portago became inseparable. However, other people allege that Nelson actually had very little functional knowledge of racing, that he was more interested in the thrill of the danger. In 1953, Alfonso de Portago got his first taste of racing at one of the most dangerous open road events of all time, the Carrera Panamericana. This race, intended to celebrate the completion of the Mexican leg of a highway designed to link North and South America from tip to tail, saw drivers carving through dense jungles and high mountain passes on roads that hardly deserved that description. In the event's 5-year history, at least 31 people died, some of them racers, some of them civilian spectators. But when Ferrari importer Luigi Chinetti asked Portago to be his co-driver, the Spaniard leaped at the chance. They were classified 98th of 182 entries and were one of over 100 cars that failed to finish the event. But Portago was positively hooked. The following year, it didn't take much goading by Franco-American racer Harry Schell before Portago was convinced to buy a Ferrari that the two could share in sports car races. Portago sourced his Ferrari in America from Luigi Chinetti, and he started to find himself competing in bigger and bigger races. In 1955, Portago was keen on joining one of the biggest marques in motorsport, Scuderia Ferrari. That season, Ferrari had a frankly impressive cast of drivers lined up for his events. Eugenio Castellotti, Nino Farina, Olivier Gendabien, Mike Hawthorne, and Maurice Trintignant took the Grand Prix side of things, while Piero Taruffi, Umberto Maglioli, and Phil Hill headed the endurance racing program. But Enzo Ferrari wasn't the kind of man to completely write off a decent driver, and he made a car available for Portago for non-championship Grand Prix and lesser sports car races. And all things considered, he had a pretty decent year. He took second in the 1955 Venezuelan Grand Prix, entering a Ferrari 750 Monza under his own name, and won the Governor's Trophy at Nassau during Bahama Speed Weeks. Those were impressive enough stats, but it was still very obvious that Portago was a little rough around the edges. He was known as a two-car man, a nickname given to drivers who seemed absolutely determined to demolish their machinery during an event and therefore need a second car. It was a rare day that the Marquess didn't burn out his brakes, clutches, or transmissions, and he was also prone to wrecking cars that a more experienced driver would have saved. Brock Yates described Portago as the original punk aristocrat who was born 5 centuries too late. He was the kind of quintessential adventurer, lover, and general rake hell of a type Ferrari loved, and that he was a brutal, uncaring driver who got around the track on nerve alone. I'm going to quote a little extensively here from Yates and his biography of Enzo Ferrari because I think it gives Portago a fully rounded character treatment. Portago worked hard to dress down, favoring leather jackets, long hair, and a stubble of a beard, and generally smelling of garlic and onions. Although he was married to a wealthy American woman, Portago carried on a number of flashy romances in Europe with the likes of international model Dorian Lay and actress Linda Christian. Accomplished at polo, bobsledding, and chasing, both steeples and females, Portago was attracted to automobile racing for its pure, brazen danger. He managed to break a leg in a 1954 Silverstone crash while developing a bravado driving style that intrigued Ferrari. Fluent in 4 languages and sufficiently infused with his royal heritage to believe he had a shot at the Spanish throne should Francisco Franco step down or be deposed, he was a favorite of Ferrari's right from the start. It was Portago's Garibaldino style that fascinated Ferrari, as well as his outrageous, audacious approach to life. It's safe to say Enzo Ferrari was sufficiently impressed with what he saw to promote Portago to the full Grand Prix team for 1956. It was a year of retirements, yet the absolute highlight of his career was second place at the British Grand Prix in a car he shared with Peter Collins. In the sports car realm, Portago also took a victory at the Tour de France in a Ferrari GT. Altogether, it was enough for Portago to keep a slot at the Scuderia heading into the 1957 season. He joined the retinue of drivers at the Italian press dubbed Il Squadra Primavera, the spring team. When Juan Manuel Fangio left Ferrari, a slate of young guns jockeyed for a slot on the Grand Prix team. The Scuderia had signed a surplus of talent to its overall racing program, albeit with no guarantee about where Ferrari might place them on any given race weekend. Maybe they'd have a shot at a Grand Prix. Maybe Enzo kept assigning you to minor sports car races. Il Commendatore was playing a game of chess, and the drivers were his pawns. Impress him, and you might just move up the ranks. If you've been a long-time listener of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, the men peopling Ferrari's spring team will be familiar by this point. Luigi Musso, Eugenio Castellotti, Peter Collins, Mike Hawthorne, Wolfgang von Trips, Olivier Gendabien, Phil Hill, and of course, Portago. Each of these men fascinated Enzo Ferrari in their own way, and the team boss seemed to take pleasure in toying with their weaknesses to see how far he could push them. And yes, DPTJ listeners who recognize these guys will also know that many of them died racing a Ferrari. The Ferrari crew headed to Argentina for the opening Grand Prix of the 1957 Formula One season, where the best finish from the team came in the form of a shared drive between Jose Froilan Gonzalez and Portago. Together, they finished 5th. Castellotti was the sports car ace of the group. In 1956, he'd won both the Mille Miglia and the 12 Hours of Sebring, so heading into 1957, he was the driver expected to lead the Ferrari team. Each year, Ferrari prepared and entered a variety of cars and drivers for events like the Mille Miglia, but there were always 1 or 2 entries that really stood out as seeming almost unstoppable, and Castellotti in those races was that driver. He was also the driver Ferrari called on in early March when he needed a record broken. Over at Autodromo di Modena, a track used by both Maserati and Ferrari as a test site, the lap record had just been broken by Jean Beira. Beira drove for Maserati. Ferrari refused to be beaten, even if Beira's record was unofficial, so he sent Castellotti over to break that record as quickly as possible. But that wasn't the real problem that Ferrari had. See, Castellotti was head over heels in love with actress and girlfriend Delia Scala, and it seemed as if his affection for her could rival his desire to race. Enzo Ferrari didn't want that, and so when he called up Castellotti to break that Modena record, it just so happened to be while Castellotti was vacationing with Scala. No matter how annoyed he was at the interruption, Castellotti couldn't exactly say no to his boss and risk his position at the team. He rushed from Florence, intent on breaking the record as quickly as possible so that he could get back to spending time with his girlfriend. When he arrived, he found a crew of mechanics and a new Tipo 801 Formula One car waiting for him. He wasted no time suiting up and blasting around the track the moment his 2.5-liter engine had warmed. On his second fast lap, he flew by the pits at over 100 miles per hour. Moments later came the sickening squeal of tires and the crunch of steel and aluminum twisting into oblivion. Castellotti was hurled 100 yards after he bounced over the curb, his Ferrari tumbling in his wake. By the time anyone arrived, Eugenio Castellotti was dead. He was just 26 years old. According to Brock Yates, the other drivers in Ferrari's stable were appalled. Peter Collins had been extremely close to Enzo, at least until Collins got married. After that, Enzo shunned him, their relationship souring and becoming almost bitter. Hill had only just joined the team and arrived in time to hear Ferrari tell reporters that he suffers when one of his cars is destroyed. When Ferrari realized that Hill was there, he quickly added, "The driver too, of course." But there was nothing much that those drivers could do, certainly not with the Mille Miglia so quickly arriving. Someone would have to replace Castellotti. Ferrari awarded that top seat to the 50-year-old Piero Taruffi, with the young guns remaining in their originally assigned roles. Then, Luigi Musso got sick just before the race, and there was no one left to call but Alfonso de Portago. Portago openly despised the event, telling reporter Ken Purdy, "A race I don't like very much is the Mille Miglia. No matter how much you practice, you can't possibly come to know 1,000 miles of Italian roads as well as the Italians. And as Fangio says, if you have a conscience, you can't drive really fast anyway. There are hundreds of corners in the Mille Miglia where one little slip by a driver will kill 50 people. You can't keep the spectators from crowding into the road. You couldn't do it with an army. It's a race I never hoped to run in." Enzo Ferrari knew that it was a risk sending the so-called madcap Marquis to his lineup. But he also had very little choice. If anything, it was likely that Il Commendatore was hoping to use that insecurity of Portago's to his advantage. As Michael Cannell describes in his book The Limit, Enzo Ferrari gathered his drivers, Portago, Wolfgang von Trips, Olivier Gendabien, Piero Taruffi, Peter Collins, and several more, at a hotel just south of the starting point in Brescia. There, Ferrari began to stick his claws into the drivers. When it came to Portago, Ferrari claimed that he was confident the Spaniard would be beaten by Gendabien, even though Gendabien was driving a less powerful machine, a Ferrari 250 GT compared to Portago's 355S. Portago determined to prove Ferrari wrong. Alfonso de Portago seemed to sense that all was not right heading into the 1957 Mille Miglia. The night before the race, as 13 Ferrari drivers and their wives and girlfriends pushed together a few tables at a restaurant in Brescia, Portago was in a reflective mood. Life has to be lived to the full, he mused to the group. It is better to be wholly alive for 30 years than half dead for 60. He had written his lover Dorian Lay, "As you know, in the first place I did not want to do the Mille Miglia. Then Ferrari said I must do it, at least in a Gran Turismo car. Then I was told I had to do it in the new 3800cc sports car. That means my early death may well come next Sunday." When asked by reporters what his goals were, Portago said that he had two. One, to finish, and the second, to make it back to Brescia safe and sound. It was a generous hope, considering he was running an immensely powerful car with no practice. On race day at 5:31 a.m., Portago and his co-driver Edmund Nelson were waved off from the start stand in Brescia to begin their 1,000-mile journey into the history books. Yes, that's the same Edmund Nelson from before, the elevator operator that Portago met in New York. He would be guiding Portago through the mess of corners, trying to beat 293 other cars that had entered the 1957 Mille Miglia. The first miles of the race were dotted by the slower cars that had been launching off the start line since 11 o'clock the night before, presenting a huge challenge to a driver anxious about this event. But when Portago and Nelson arrived at their first checkpoint, they were told they ranked 4th overall, with nothing but fellow Ferraris in front. If they'd already made it up to 4th, surely second place could be possible. And just like that, Portago's fears fell away. Instead, he was consumed by the overwhelming desire to win, and to win at all costs. The race continued. At a checkpoint in Rome, actress Linda Christian burst through the crowd to snatch a passionate kiss from her lover behind the wheel, and despite the pressure to keep moving, Portago obliged. Soon after, he seemed to lose his nerve. As the route wound through the Apennines, snow fell, and as they carved to the lower elevations, that snow turned to a steady drizzle. Portago slowed down and drove with care. But at the final stop of the race, just south of Bologna, Ferrari's pre-race warning to Portago had come true. Olivier Jean-Dabian had managed to pass him, and Portago was now placed in 5th. Enzo Ferrari was there in Bologna, and despite the bad news, he did have a morsel of information that might just push Portago into action. Up in second place, Peter Collins' transaxle was breaking, and he surely wouldn't finish. Plus, in the lead, Piero Taruffi's rear end was grinding. "Alas," Ferrari said, "you're still behind Jean-Dabian, just as I said." Just moments before, Enzo had told Olivier Jean-Dabian that he had better pick up the pace, because Portago was catching up. Portago saw Ferrari's words for what they were, a warning. As he prepared to head out of the pits, he resolved to overcome his fear of this race. He could beat Jean-Dabian, and if he managed that, then it sounded like he had a damn good shot at inheriting the coveted second place. And with nothing but a long, straight stretch of road remaining through the Po River Valley, Portago was confident he could pass all of those cars on sheer pace alone. He was in the process of pulling from the pits when a mechanic flagged him to point out that the left front control arm was bent, pushing the tire ever so slightly into the bodywork of the car. They needed to do a tire change. Now. But Portago waved them off. He wouldn't waste any more time. All seemed fine as he and Nelson got back on their way, and the confident pace only quickened when they rocketed past the broken-down Ferrari of Peter Collins. 1 down, 2 to go, and Jean-Dabian must be over the horizon. Fewer than 30 miles remained, and Portago was on the road to Guidizzolo, a narrow but flat stretch carving its way toward a stone commune that saw speeds brush beyond 160 miles per hour. Not far behind that would be the finish line, an end to what had been nearly 14 consecutive hours of driving, in the conviction that he had beaten Enzo Ferrari's expectations. A handful of locals had gathered on the side of the road, leaving the comfort of their homes to creep up to the pavement and watch the most dominant cars of the Mille Miglia run to the finish. All those spectators saw of Alfonso de Portago's Ferrari was a hunk of red-painted metal rocketing directly at them. The car was just high enough to miss the first row of spectators, but it pinwheeled into the second row before coming to a brutal stop against a pole. The car disintegrated, showering shards of metal into the crowd as the hunk of twisted Ferrari finally came to rest in a drainage ditch. Alfonso de Portago was dead. He had been scythed in half when the hood of his Ferrari recoiled back into his body. Beside him, his friend and co-driver Edmund Nelson had also been killed. 10 limp bodies studded the grass. 5 of those were children. For all of his bad omens before the race, Portago had always been cavalier about his motorsport activities. "I won't die in an accident," he boasted. "I'll die of old age or be executed in some gross miscarriage of justice." Edmund Nelson disagreed. Every time Portago comes in from a race, the front of his car is wrinkled where he's been nudging people out of the way at 130 miles per hour. Nelson believed his friend wouldn't live to be 30. Now, both were killed, side by side, racing to the finish of the Mille Miglia. Earlier that week, Alfonso de Portago was asked to pen a feature in Sports Illustrated, where he was quoted as saying, "When I have actually lost control of the car, there is absolutely nothing I can do except sit still, frozen with fear, and wait for events to take their natural course." The United Press contended that with that statement, Portago had written his own obituary. In the same article, Portago asked, "Do we ever get frightened? We get terrified. Fear is the awareness of danger. Whenever a driver makes a mistake and loses control of his car, even for a split second, the danger is acute and he is frightened. Sometimes when a friend is killed, you swear that you will never race again. The next day you think, this could never happen to me." But on May 12, 1957, it did happen to Alfonso de Portago. I want to pull another quote from Robert Daly's book Cars at Speed, because I think it really beautifully captures this tragedy. "His life was intense, and at 28, complete. There are those who wrote afterward that he was in love with death, but they did not know him, and this statement is absurd. Alfonso de Portago was in love with life. Perhaps we appreciate life more," he wrote of racing drivers, "because we live closer to death. He seemed to me the most alive man I had ever known. He was sensitive, restless, curiously gentle, and it is impossible to describe the impression of straining vitality which he communicated, nor to do justice to the overwhelming disbelief his friends felt when news of his death arrived. It seemed like he had everything a man could need with which to challenge life: charm, looks, wealth, and courage. If he failed, his friends thought, what chance has anyone? The answer was obvious: none. Portago was not merely killed. In the wreck, the hood of the car lashed back and cut him in two. As his body was laid to rest in a family tomb in Madrid, he was mourned in many parts of the rest of the world. Jean Béra, the French driver, said, "Only those who do not move do not die." But are they not already dead? The fallout from the 1957 Mille Miglia accident was swift. Scuderia Ferrari had swept the top 3 finishing positions at the end of the 1,000-mile adventure, with Piero Taruffi leading the charge for the final victory of his career. Rather than celebrate, Enzo Ferrari was slapped with 11 counts of manslaughter charges. In Italy, laws stated that for every death, there must be someone responsible, and in the case of motorsport, this meant that if someone had died during a race, then Italian law dictated someone had to be held liable. With Alfonso de Portago dead, Enzo Ferrari was dragged into court to defend himself and his racing operation. Similar charges were later raised against Colin Chapman of Lotus when Jochen Rindt died at the 1970 Italian Grand Prix, and against the leaders of the Williams F1 team when Ayrton Senna died at Imola in 1994. Enzo Ferrari spent 3 years battling the charges in court. Even as Osservatore Romano, the official newspaper of the Vatican, compared him to Saturn, the titan of myth who ate his own children in order to survive. The case languished in court until finally Ferrari was able to convince the judge to assemble a panel of automotive engineers in order to actually find out what happened. They determined that the accident had to do with the cat's eye, which was a reflector on the road. Portago must have struck it at the wrong angle and lost control. Enzo Ferrari was acquitted. As for the rest of the 1957 season and beyond, the team found itself forced to undergo a hierarchy change. Eugenio Castellotti and Alfonso de Portago had been rising stars of the team, and when the racing season continued on in full force, Enzo Ferrari had no time for futile things like mourning. Instead, drivers Wolfgang von Trips and Phil Hill were both lifted up the ranks. Both had been subject to ample criticism from Il Commendatore, and both had suffered the indignity of demotions or sidelinings when a better option came along. Now, with the team's ranks almost exhausted, they earned the promotion they'd both desperately craved, and that they now accepted with apprehension. As for the Mille Miglia itself, well, there was simply no way the race could continue, at least not as a high-speed event. After the wreck, Italian paper Corriere d'Informazione carried a headline that translated to the Mille Miglia, Cemetery of Babies and Men, enough. With the Le Mans tragedy not even 2 years in the past, newspapers around the world began to publish their opinion that the race should be canceled. That Tuesday night after the crash, the Italian Automobile Club and the Italian Motorcycle Federation drafted joint statements to call off the Mille Miglia in the future. A quick response? Yes, but the impact of the accident lingered. Again, I want to pull from Robert Daly's Cars at Speed because he raises a really fascinating point about why the Mille Miglia was canceled. And it seemingly has less to do with the deaths of all those spectators than with the death of Alfonso de Portago himself. Even the death of such a man as Portago in 1957, while perhaps capable of extinguishing the Mille Miglia, is probably not enough to crush road racing permanently. For the conviction is inescapable that the Mille Miglia was stopped not because Portago's car killed 11 persons, but because it killed a figure as glamorous as Portago. He had been romantic in an age which had no time for romance. He had been a sort of modern conquistador, and much of the world watched breathlessly the fantastic things he tried and got away with. Other races killed more people, Le Mans, Argentina, Monza, but were raced again the next year. For no driver as renowned as Portago was killed, and the headlines had died out in a day or two. It was, to my mind, the Portago publicity which stopped the Mille Miglia, the grisly funerals at Guidizzolo, and then again at Madrid, the impassioned declarations of the movie actress he had been living with, the photos of his wife, his children, and the former mistress who had borne him an illegitimate son, his fantastic wealth, the pronouncement of the grief-stricken Fangio, Portago's friend, that the Mille Miglia, first run in 1927, must not be run again. To Daly's mind, this overwhelming public sentiment that a little bit of the romantic enchantment left in the world had been snuffed out alongside Alfonso de Portago is the primary reason the Mille Miglia ended. And in a lot of ways, it's hard to disagree with him. We've spoken about the 1955 Le Mans disaster on Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys before. Hands down, the most horrifying racing incident of all time that killed 80 spectators, and how the impact of the crash did result in a worldwide rethink of motorsport. As a result, a lot of Grand Prix were canceled in 1955. Switzerland banned motorsport entirely, and in America, the AAA stepped back from sanctioning racing and opened the door for a new organization called USAC to take over. But we still race at Le Mans, and for all the events that were canceled in response to the 1955 tragedy, there were plenty of others that went ahead as planned, without a second thought. Given that Daly published this book in 1961, I do think public sentiment had started to shift, particularly as these incidents became more publicized. It's hard to fathom the destruction ravaged by a crash like Pierre Levesque's at Le Mans if all you consume of it are a few poorly lit photographs and some news articles. It was easier to mourn a singular man who seemed so glamorous and impervious to death. That sentiment remained for quite a while, at least until motorsport became more easily consumable. Seeing a crash happen live on your television is a drastically different experience than passively reading about it after the fact, and a lot of fans started to realize that actually, all of this death was unacceptable. I do still think that we've retained a greater bias toward losing great drivers. something that's painfully obvious when we talk about the horror of losing Ayrton Senna at the San Marino Grand Prix, all while forgetting to mention that the day before, Roland Ratzenberger had been killed there as well. One man was a wildly popular world champion. The other had started exactly one Grand Prix. Ratzenberger's death left a bad taste in the mouths of race fans, but it was Senna's death that was deemed harrowing enough to make sweeping changes to safety. Of course, I think there's also something to be said for the fact that the Mille Miglia was a race run on public roads, while Daly's other examples focus on racing incidents at closed courses. There's a certain level of risk associated with attending a motor race, so while you may not be expecting to be killed at Le Mans, there is at least kind of a sense you've agreed to that risk that it could happen. Most tickets to racing events keep that disclaimer on there today. What made the 1957 Mille Miglia crash so uniquely horrifying was the fact that it killed several families who just happened to live alongside the racecourse. Those families may have gone out to watch the cars rush by, but it wasn't like they had any say in where the race was run. They didn't choose to attend the event. It was happening in front of their homes whether they liked it or not. And they were killed simply because of where they lived. I'm sure the extinguishing of Portago's bright life kept the story in the papers for a long time, but I'd also hope that the readers were able to understand that the folks who were killed weren't even necessarily motorsport fans, and that they were killed steps away from the safety of their home. But I can't say that Daly was wrong. The Mille Miglia was canceled almost instantly, but other open road races were allowed to continue as if a very similar accident couldn't happen anywhere else. In Sicily, the Targa Florio carved through the mountains until 1977. Plus, there were plenty of closed course tracks that still ran dangerously close to civilization, meaning that it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine a Formula One car rocketing into your pantry out in the Belgian countryside, or a sports car coming to rest among your flock of sheep. Digging through Portago's obituaries, it's clear that he received the kind of treatment you didn't get from the press when a lesser-known driver died. The AP referred to him as perhaps the most glamorous and exciting sports figure of our time, and dedicated ample page space to romanticizing his life, which was referred to as, quote, one big tryst with Russian roulette on steeplechase courses, icy bobsled runs, and the neck-risking sports car courses of the world. Other articles painted a beautiful picture of the family he'd abandoned, and the liaisons he'd had with women like Dorian Lay and Linda Christian. In almost all of these stories, his co-driver, Edmund Nelson, generally receives no page space. And if he did earn some, it was nothing more than a short paragraph. Countless men like Edmund Nelson had been killed in the racing world, and many had taken other lives on their way out. But their story was less appealing than that of the handsome nobleman risking his life for a taste of glory. And as for the dead spectators, they remained nameless and faceless, referred to only by their number. The tragedy of the whole situation firmly centered around Alfonso de Portago. Because of all of that, I do think the 1957 Mille Miglia raises uncomfortable questions that we've been faced with time and time again in motorsport, and that I don't think we've ever adequately addressed. When does a crash matter? Why do we respond to some driver deaths with a hard heart and a shrug, when others demand periods of national mourning and sweeping regulatory changes to ensure no such tragedy happens again? And what does that say about us as race fans, as a society, as human beings? If you have an answer, please let me know. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to be revisiting the early history of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, including the mysteries and tragedies of some of its earliest races. We're kicking things off with the 1909 Press Delight and Wheeler-Shebler Trophy races, controversial events that claimed the lives of drivers, riding mechanics, and spectators. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. If you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack, and if you have questions, opportunities, or you just want to reach out, I have an email for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each episode, but the full list is always down in the description. This week I'm pulling from a few familiar sources: The Limit by Michael Cannell, Cars at Speed by Robert Daly, and my beloved Enzo Ferrari biographies written by Luca Del Monte and Brock Yates. The full titles of all those books are down in the description, along with a few other news stories and features. If you're curious about what reporting on these horrific accidents looked like back in the day, a lot of these links don't require a subscription to read. That's all from me this week. I'll see you real soon for another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Thanks for listening.